for pass-through income.
Yeah, because I wanted to move us over to the corporate tax side,
Okay.
as there are many changes happening on that end too. Yet, unlike many of the changes happening with personal tax rates, which are set to expire in 2025, these corporate rate cuts are permanent. Is that also the case when it comes to the pass through cut?
No, the pass-through deduction is again temporary. And so what happens is it's very complicated when you have the individual tax rates that are significantly different, in this case higher than corporate tax rates. So corporate tax rates have been dropped to 21%.
From 35.
From 35%, and that is a significant savings. One of the ways that the administration has tried to sell this as not hurting individuals is they're arguing that those corporate tax benefits trickle down to wage earners. And so they're saying somehow they monetized, wage earners are going to have a $4,000 wage increase. That is not what economists have thought historically, and so it's counter to empirical research that exists, that you would have that much of a trickle over to individuals. What is interesting is, so many individuals who have the flexibility, typically higher income individuals who have the flexibility, are saying, well, we should incorporate. So we should shift income from individual tax rates, which are higher, because the highest individual tax rate is 37%, shift that to corporations, where the highest tax rate is 21%, to immediately get this windfall tax savings. Well, what becomes odd is if rates are changing all the time, it's very difficult to plan when things phase in and phase out. But you're right, the corporate tax rate cut is permanent. The individual tax rate cuts are not, and they don't even last through the end of the period. They expire at the end of 2025, which it's hard to believe isn't that far away. So the way the deduction works is very interesting. It is a 20% deduction for your pass-through income. And pass-through income for this purpose is a sole proprietorship, a partnership, or an S corp. And so a wage earner doesn't get this deduction, but yet a sole proprietor does. So I am concerned that businesses will push their employees to become sole proprietors, trying to sell this deduction to them through the federal tax system. But the problem with that is, if you're a sole proprietor, you have to pay both halves of your payroll taxes. In addition, if you're a sole proprietor, you're not going to get health care benefits. You're not going to get sick leave. You're not going to get vacation benefits. And so that is a dangerous transition for folks who have been employees, have gotten good benefits. And in Nevada, because of our unions, we typically do have pretty good employee benefits. And so to give those up for this alleged deduction, which is temporary, is not necessarily the right thing to do. People need to run the numbers and make sure that the safety nets that they've relied on as being an employee are not lost.
Yeah, and another thing that started to get some more attention is the repatriation provision, where the White House and Republican leaders have been selling this as, we're going to bring all this money that's overseas, bring it back to America, and in turn, that will mean more jobs for Americans. But, well, are they being completely honest about what this repatriation program is actually about?
And not at all, because our current income tax system on businesses, we currently, under 2017, we tax individuals and businesses on their worldwide income. That has been criticized in the past, and that is why some companies have done reverse mergers into Canadian companies to try to not be incorporated in the US and not be cited here, not be located here. But as we know, the US has great benefits for businesses now with the reduced corporate tax cut. And so what they've also done is effectively given them a great other windfall businesses tax cut, in that we're now going to territorial taxation. And so to the extent you have foreign earned income offshore, it's not subject to worldwide taxation. It's subject to taxation in that territory. And so, not surprisingly, a lot of economists think that is going to bring jobs offshore, not onshore. And what many of us are really concerned about is something we've talked about for a while, and that is a race to the bottom. If you drop the corporate tax rate to 21%, guess what? It's not going to be low enough, because there'll be other countries that will try to attract businesses and US dollars, so they'll have a lower rate. And then businesses will just keep pushing a race to the bottom. And somebody's got to pay for our civilized society. So if businesses aren't doing it, guess who it has to be? Individuals.
Yeah, and that gets back to the individual rate cuts being temporary, while the corporate rate cuts are permanent.
Absolutely. So the Tax Policy Center and the Center on Budget Priority and Policy, they have looked at the distribution of the tax costs, tax increases and tax decreases relative to the status quo. So let's just say nothing changed. Let's look out to 2027. If you look out to 2027, comparing current law to what will be in 2027, at every income level there are tax increases, because the rates come up and we're using a different indexing for inflation, a much slower indexing, which is going to cause bracket creep. And so you'll be in a higher bracket even though your nominal dollars are not that high because of the much slower indexing.
What's been referred to as chain CPI.
Exactly. And that's not just in the rate schedules, but that is in everything kind of moving up. So the standard deduction is indexed for inflation, but it won't grow as quickly as it would have under the old indexing for inflation. And so these are stealth increases. And one way the government has argued this is not a tax increase for individuals is by arguing those corporate tax cuts are going to go to the individuals, not the shareholders, because we're seeing that in the stock market, but to wage earners. And that just has not been consistent with long, well-published, well-documented economic evidence. And what is interesting is we have a living laboratory. One of the nice things about the United States is we have 50 states plus the District of Columbia plus Puerto Rico, and we can look at the different state tax laws and see how those have worked and how they haven't worked. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? Kansas is a perfect example of how this pass-through cut didn't work. So Kansas enacted state tax laws where all pass-through business income was actually subject to a 0% rate. So guess what? Every doctor and lawyer and anyone who could transition themselves from a wage earner, a W-2 wage earner, to a pass-through entity, they did. And so the tax revenue, rather than increasing, because they thought this would stimulate the economy, just like the current administration is saying, it didn't. It didn't, to the point that they actually were considering closing public schools on Fridays. They ran out of money. And as a result, they had to go back and increase taxes. And so we have a great example of how this didn't work and how this race to the bottom can end up really hurting education and other services that we all rely on to lift us all up.
And haven't we also seen this to an extent at the federal level, where for the past 40 some years, wages for middle and lower income workers have, especially when adjusted for inflation, been stagnant. Even after the tax cuts of the 1980s and after the tax cuts of the 2000s.
Absolutely. We have one of the reasons we have record income and wealth inequality is wage stagnation. Even though our employment numbers are good, have gotten a lot better since the Great Recession, we have record income inequality. And if you look at the median income levels, they have just in the last couple of years, because of the stimulation from the Obama administration and the economy just finally circling back, we've finally seen some increases. And what's wonderful about those increases for the last 2 years, and I'm talking, everything is backward looking, so we're talking 2015 and 16, the poverty measurements just came out. We saw increases in 2015 and 2016 for across the board. So it wasn't just white men, it was women. We finally saw the wage gap between men and women close a little bit, a couple pennies, but it's finally moving in the right direction, as well as for people of color across the board. They're starting to see their median income come up. So that did not happen after the Bush tax cuts. That did not happen after the Reagan tax cuts. And we're finally seeing it, and most importantly, poverty has come down because wages are have been creeping up. But most importantly, healthcare coverage. Healthcare coverage has hit record levels in the United States because of the Affordable Care Act, because of the great subsidies that lower income people can enjoy to ensure they have quality healthcare. This tax bill repeals the individual mandate, which means that Affordable Care Act, which relies on making sure that we have a mandate so everyone has to have health care, making sure that pre-existing conditions are not priced into health care, and lastly, because everyone has to get health care, making sure there's a subsidy. And so by eliminating the mandate, that tripod falls apart, and we have what Justice Roberts has actually described in his opinion, saying it was constitutional, a death spiral. Because premiums go up, well, if premiums go up, fewer people, especially healthy people, get in, and it just continues to go up.
And this explains why
people get out.
Why we've seen analysis that this could lead to 13 million more uninsured people.
13 million more uninsured, and then premium increases for all of us, which if you look at bankruptcies and what is the trigger that often pushes people into poverty, it's healthcare costs.
Yeah, and I guess to bring this around full circle, we've been talking about income inequality, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest challenge we face as a society right now. And now we have this tax bill where about 82.8% of the benefits go to the top 1% of income earners. Last year, President Trump campaigned on looking out for the little guy. Yesterday, when he was promoting this bill on the Senate floor, Senator Dean Heller basically said, if you're against this bill, you're against tax cuts for the middle class. And yet we see in this bill, the benefits are disproportionately going to a very select group of people. What does this ultimately mean for our economy, for our society?
Well, individuals need to have the confidence in our economy and disposable cash flow to spend. Nothing's more important than that than during the holiday season now. Most businesses live or die on the holiday season. And so consumer spending grows the economy. When you get tax cuts to someone who has a gross estate of over $11 million, an additional $4 million is not going to be spent. That just goes into the big pool of funds that they say. Mm-hmm. It's not stimulating the economy. Yeah. When you give tax cuts to working and middle class people, they spend it. The earned income tax credit is a great example. A lot of individuals have said, well, you can't give tax cuts to people who don't pay income tax. First of all, there's a myriad of different taxes. Payroll taxes are 15.3% effective rate on $1, and sales tax in Nevada is over 8%, and property taxes, and even if you're a renter, you're effectively paying some of that. So there's a lot of taxes that get paid. In addition to we've got entertainment taxes now, we've got the sin taxes on marijuana and alcohol and cigarettes and et cetera, et cetera. So everybody pays taxes. What's interesting though is we could have stimulated the working individuals, working families with kids. Don't we want to support kids? We need kids to effectively grow up, get good jobs, be consumers, be workers, and stimulate the economy. We could have increased the earned income tax credit. That would have put dollars into households and they would have spent it. The empirical evidence is an earned income tax credit refund and it has a multiplier effect of 1.6, 1.5 to 2. And they spend it locally. Where do they spend it? In vulnerable communities. That creates jobs in those communities. And that's going to lift all of us. Giving it to an individual who already has $11 million, they're not going to go out and spend it. And so this doesn't have the stimulative effect. In addition, the one group that we're taxing into poverty are childless, lower income workers, minimum wage workers that don't have kids, are not able to claim them as dependents. That population is taxed into poverty. When you're taxed into poverty, what does that do? It doesn't motivate you to work harder. So we could have, and the Obama administration had proposed, and actually Senator Ryan was supportive of increase the childless earned income tax credit. We could have done that. There's so many things we could have done. We could have made the child tax credit fully refundable. That would have targeted really well the people we're talking about who would spend it and stimulate businesses. Instead, we repealed the estate tax on these high individuals who already have high net worths, who already have high income, and they're not going to spend it. In addition, the child tax credit, we targeted it, they lifted the phase out. So now a $400,000 income family with 2 children, under current law, they get $0 for child tax credit. $400,000. That's not low income, that's not middle income, that's high income. Now, under the new law, as of January 1st, 2018, they will get, for 2 kids, $4,000. That's a significant increase. Whereas working mom, minimum wage, who has however many kids, her increase will be $75 for the entire year. It's a minimum wage mom. As soon as she gets that money, she has to spend it. She doesn't have a choice. So this is going to exacerbate income and wealth inequality and cause frustration and anger, especially if the next phase of this is to cut entitlements.
As in cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Medicaid, and SNAP or school lunches. It's chilling to think we're going to cut food for hungry children, or Section 8 housing for low-income families, or even worse, CHIP, a health care for kids who don't qualify for Medicaid. That's a gap, fills a void for them. We're going to not have health care for young, vulnerable kids in order to put more money into the wealthiest Americans. Doesn't make sense.
And you don't think that stimulates the economy?
No, because they're not spending it. They don't need to spend it. It's not disposable income. It just goes into, we've seen this mass accumulation among families. The way we mitigate that is through an estate tax.